Hello, everyone, and welcome to our segment today entitled The JQ and Zionism. We are going to go back in time and try to make sense of some of the world events going on today with our guest, Catholic State. How are you doing today, Catholic State?
Oh, I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on, Doug.
Excellent. Well, I'll give us a little bit of a preview of what we're going to be doing. Last time I talked about the JQ, I think the actual concept has been lost. It was something that was examined at a very scholarly and theological level 100 and 150 years ago, and it's kind of been lost. It's just kind of this general phrase people used. So, to some extent, I want to revisit that. But what I want to think about is where we're at with this concept called Zionism in the world today, the influence and how it sort of is reflected in media as well. But to a major extent, what we're going to go to is an article from 1937 from Civiltà Cattolica. Now, I have often referenced Civiltà Cattolica 1890, but Catholic State and I were able to translate this article. Let me
hmm
briefly talk about what we do over on Communities. It's pretty exciting. We've kind of revamped some of the things we do throughout the week. So typically at the beginning of the week, I take the Metaverse book now over the next year. We're going to find one concept from that, just dig into it and see how it applies to the world today. We have a new show that we're going to run out for the year. It's called Connect the Dots, where we're going to take underexplored stories and a few of our comments, and that's so far off to a great start. And on Fridays we do a program. Our usual guest is Catholic State, and we're specifically going after memory hold material, and that's what we're really doing here today, giving you a little slice of what we do on Fridays. We'll be here for 45 minutes to an hour, and we're going to be going over to locals. I will leave the link to our locals as per usual in the description section. If you're interested in this, it's really a community. People are able to post, share ideas. It's an actual community over there. We look at the deep state and the deep church. And fundamentally, if you're interested, the bottom line is we build one another's faith and we lift one another up over there. So that's generally what we're doing. It's no toxic zone over there is what we're all about. But you're going to see like-minded people digging into these events in the world today, getting through the BS of the mainstream media and the controlled alternative media and getting into it from a deep Catholic perspective. And it's just very exciting what's going on over there. And again, the book, The Metaverse and the Saying Through the Singularity, will be in the links as well. As I get going here and set this up for today, I'm going to begin by saying this, that my background is in political science. I'm a doctor of political science. I have spent my life in the very far fringes doing things, within the international context of biopower and these kind of things. And the reason I put such an emphasis on this idea of a cosmic conspiracy or the metaphysical aspects of what's going on in the world, one of the people I was very influenced by was Eric Vogelin, and he was a political science as well from Germany. And he stated it's sort of a revolutionary idea that the problems in this world today are a disorder of mind, a disorder of consciousness, and it stemmed essentially from heresy. And we dug into that on Monday this week. So, what I see going on in the world today, a lot of it is going to be connected to this thing called Zionism, but a lot of it is just disordered thinking that's affect, he would say, deform the souls of the world. And if you're interested in that kind of stuff, we just did a segment on it last Monday on locals. But I was very influenced by that and looked at this idea of the cosmic conspiracy, and that was a big theme in my book, Seeing Through the Singularity, unpacking the cosmic conspiracy, that there is this conspiracy against God and man, Christ and his church. And something that goes through both redemption history and secular history is this enmity between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent, taking on various typologies that we see. Idea in our age, it's the church versus the synagogue, and there's a cosmic battle going on that's reflected in our secular affairs. So to that extent, today I want to look at Zionism and its role in the world affairs. And again, to come back to baseline for what we do here, I argue that there's an ontological war over reality. Ontology is God, he is being. And there's this war with this non-being, this sort of Zohar Kabbalistic concept that picks away at God to create a new being. In a sense, it's crushing God and the church in order to build up the synagogues, Messiah or Antichrist. And that's the ground is being prepared with events we see every day. And that might have sounded kind of far out 5-10 years ago, but when we see events today, it's like, yeah, that probably should be included to some extent when we look at affairs in the Middle East. So that's a bigger picture of what we're doing and what's going on in the world. And what I really want to untangle today a little bit is the idea of Zionism and the JQ. So I will return to what we discussed last week with the JQ, but is there overlap? Are they the same thing? So I've spoke quite a bit here, Justin. You read the same article that I did. Did you enjoy the read?
Oh yeah, it's a good stuff. It's good stuff. Yeah, the Jewish Question and Zionism. I mean, it's just a continuation of church teaching, as it's always been, like, which is that we cannot be Zionists as Catholics.
Wow. Yeah. When you hear people like Stephen Bannon saying the trads, I got them, we're all Zionists. And you're like, okay. And then people are just kind of following this, and it gets into what we call the Trump deception, which a lot of people aren't quite ready for that, but I can tap on current events for just a moment. What I'd like to open with before we get into the article and even remind ourselves of the Jewish question from last week, Secretary of State Michael Pompeo said at one point in time, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. So I can't even unpack the events from each week at a time when what's going on. People are being deported in America. I was going to save this, but just in my lifetime, nothing like the events going on have happened. And again, we talk about Mar-a-Lago Catholics and this idea of you can get this egregore where you're kind of taken away from examining the fullness of reality, and so many crazy things, like you can't escape some of the people being deported in America for social media posts. I teach this stuff on constitutional law. This is such an affront to the foundations of America that people should be. This is the event of our time. This is just insane. And part of this larger project of what we call Zionism is it's not going to start with the Middle East. The implications of the JQ come into play. What is the agenda here? What's the overlapping agenda that we're going to look at? But just for starters, oh my goodness, what's going on right now? And we know from just theories of government, when there's no pushback, this tyranny will broaden. So at the very least, this is very much of a political science conversation that we're also having today. But let me go briefly right now. And what I want to mention are some of the influencers that I listen to that can give us great insight into what's going on in the world today. I wish I could say they're Catholic, but they are not. They're all Jewish. And these are the important voices of our day. And I'm just going to mention a few of them. People like Katie Halper and Aaron Matei. They have a show called Useful Idiots. People have heard of Norman Finkelstein. There's a program called Do Dissonance with two fellas over there that do great work. The Gray Zone with Matt Blumenthal. Dave Smith, you all heard of him. Glenn Greenwald, Jeffrey Sachs. People like Max Blumenthal and Aaron Matei even did a show this week looking at Shabbat, Schneerson, the influence on Trump. This is stuff that would be, they have a large audience. Stuff that we've been going through for over 8 years right now is hitting the mainstream. Like, this needs to be discussed, and it's being discussed by Jewish podcasters. So hats off to these guys. It's so significant what they're doing. They are doing truth telling, and it's beautiful. So hats off. And most of these guys are the kind of guys I would hang out with. I spent half my life in New York City. These are the kind of guys and gals that I would hang out with. That said, there's a problem. And that's what we're getting into today. they seem to indicate all of these people, except for Norman Finkelstein recently said that the problem is not so much Zionism, but Jewish supremacism. And I want to return to that in just one moment. But for the most part, these people seem to say the problem in the world is Zionism. Now, what I could do is go up to Wikipedia and read the first paragraph. So what is officially the definition of this thing? But that's sort of a problem, because there's this kind of clue. We're more assimilated. We feel and care for these people that are being purged. We care about people's rights, and these are all great things. I would argue these are things that Christianity brought into the world, and a lot of people, whether they're agnostic or atheist or humanistic, are still feeding off the fumes of Christianity. But that's not the case I'm necessarily making right now. But the problem is that this agenda that's going on today in our world, ethnic cleansing and all of this, and the control of governments and the lying and the mayhem and the carnage, it's part of something we discussed with the JQ. It's part of an ancient agenda. And I want to return to that. So can these things really be coupled? So that said, I think it's a problem. I think just saying it's Zionism, I'm not a Zionist. If we could just have, I speak for the true JQers over here, and that's not really true historically speaking. So I think that they are missing a part of reality. They tend to go back to the World War II narrative, which is also problematic. That's the same narrative that Jules Isaac brought into Vatican II to change our teaching. And again, I know I'm kind of floating here, but I do want to remind people that we began last week. Here's what's coming up with another one of these JQ groups. The International Theological Commission wants to return to Nostra Aetate, the teaching on the JQ. And right now, what they want to put into Catholic teaching is evolutionary teaching, which is anathema to the church, historically understood. They want the acceptance of heretical sects as new revelations, very radical, very much an abomination. And more importantly, that God's covenant with the Jewish people was not revoked. And that's interesting, because that's simply, Nostra Aetate already stepped back from these things like collective guilt and deicide, and the idea of some notion that there was an enmity between these two things. And again, we're speaking today on Good Friday. The article we're going to read today even mentions the word perfidious. So that's kind of interesting. But I think it's important to us to realize, and I would say to these people, in the spirit of St. Maximilian Kolbe, who died in a concentration camp, who talked about the JQ and the relevance. We can't defend the church. This is, I believe, what the saints of the apocalypse are telling us. We simply can't defend the church. We can't go into the beatific vision of the faithful unless we address this question honestly, as it was historically understood by the church, even if it makes people uncomfortable. So from the perspective of St. Maximilian, his deepest desire with the Immaculata was to put the gospel out to Freemasons, to the Jewish people of the world, and say that Christ is the fullness of the truth. He gave the world this idea that we all have value because we were created in the image of God. So I would just ask these people that I very much respect to open up their hearts and minds to the ultimate reality of the world, which is the revelation from God made through the incarnation of Christ, and it confirmed his divinity through the death, resurrection, and ascension. He sits at the right hand of God, and through an opening, through grace, if you're opened up to that grace, because he is knocking, and you can inherit the promise, not of an earthly kingdom of earthly goods, but the promise of eternal life, eternal salvation, and freedom from sin, which is the ultimate freedom that our Blessed Mother helps us work through. A lot of talk in there, Justin. How you doing?
Oh, I'm good. No. I mean, you were setting us up for success. So yeah, this article we're going to talk about today. I mean, it's a continuation of church teaching that's been around since at least St. Augustine. St. Augustine and the City of God created what's called the doctrine of the witness people, which says that since 70 AD, when the Second Temple was destroyed, and particularly since 135 AD, after the complete dispersion from Jerusalem for the Jews after the Bar Kokhba revolt, the doctrine of the witness people from Augustine essentially says that the Jews, since they rejected Christ on Good Friday, right, on today, since they rejected Christ, they are to be dispersed amongst all peoples, all Gentiles, until their conversion at the end of time, which has not happened yet, right? They are dispersed to be witnesses to us. So what does witness mean? It means that they, in their Tanakh, which we call the Old Testament, they have the prophecies concerning Christ, meaning that they, even though they reject Christ, their prophets, their own scriptures say that he is the Messiah, right? So that is, and they are to be witnesses, as Pope Innocent III said in Ut Esse Cain, like Cain, to have the mark on their forehead, to be, cursed like Cain, wanderers across the face of the earth, and to not have a homeland again until the end of time when they convert. So this has always been the doctrine of the church since at least Augustine, at least like even before Augustine, the church fathers understood this, but he was the one that kind of precisely, made the doctrine of the witness people as the church understood it. But yeah, so that's what we're really going to talk about today. And we've got quotes from saints, like I do on my website, and that Deep State does, all the way up through the early 20th century, like even up when Pope St. Pius X told Theodore Herzl, the father of Zionism, we can't endorse Zionism because you reject our Lord. We can't, as long as you reject our Lord, we can't accept Zionism, right? So this right here, this document we're going to talk about today, is actually the Civiltà Cattolica. It was, which is the Jesuit publication under the authority of the Pope, right? So the Pope has to sign off on it. This one was published in 1937, volume 88, number 2. It's called The Jewish Question Zionism, and it's essentially a review of Hilaire Belloc, the great earliest 20th century Catholic author, right? Hilaire Belloc, I'm sure most people know who I'm talking about. Yep. He wrote a book called The Jews. So this is essentially a summary of his position on why Zionism is not feasible as a Catholic position.
Yep. Great. So just a couple of things. I'll get the period of time in the 1930s set up. But let's do a quick, according to Wikipedia, Zionism is an ethno-cultural nationalist movement that emerged in Europe in the late 19th century that aimed to establish a national home for the Jewish people pursued through the colonization of Palestine, a region roughly corresponding to the land of Israel and Judaism. With the central importance in Jewish history, Zionism wanted to create a Jewish state in Palestine with as much land and as many Jews and as few Palestinians as possible. Well, they're really advancing that as few of them as possible lately. So this is what they call the Likud party, or the radical Kananis. The really radical part has really taken hold in the last few years. And there's so many different avenues we could take. But the article we're doing today takes place in the 1930s. Last week, we talked about two great books dealing with the JQ, one just before Vatican II and one just after it. And this just world-class scholarship, always dealing with the same cosmic conspiracy, that it's just hard for us, I want to say modern, but I want to say contemporary. Today, it's hard for us to hear some of this language, but it's just so blunt. And we're going to return to some of that. But what I want to remind people of, this is classic memory hold stuff that we deal with. We go into the different articles each week, but we even have book lists over there for people that want to explore this question over on our local station. But I do believe that some of the people that I mentioned that look into the issue today of ethnic cleansing, of censorship, they are to some extent being gatekeepers, whether they realize it or not, because they're not dealing with the JQ. And the JQ is, I can imagine, it's hard to think about that I'm associated with a group whose goal is to bring down, from a Christian perspective, bring down the church, break their identity, break their belief system in order to make this new world order for us. That's what you're historically a part of. And we can dig into that from next week again. But here's the 1930s. This is a time when who's writing about the JQ? And I'm only hitting the tip of the iceberg. We have to go into these sources and all the footnotes in English and French and Spanish and German to really get into it, which these books do. But Father Fahey, Nora Webster, Henry Ford, Winston Churchill, Hillel Belloc, and so many more. Saint Maximilian Kolbe would one time cite the protocols, which is also, there's a great externalization going on in this world. I believe some of it was controlled in order to achieve this Zionist perspective. And we can touch on that. But I just want to remind ourselves, when this article was written in 1937, this topic was being considered. Part of why, the reason why it was being considered was because one of the possible solutions was Zionism. If the Jews who God had scattered in this diaspora around the world, if they had a homeland, would the problems go away? So that's just putting some kind of context. Now, the article in Civiltà Cattolica 1937 does have to just rehash what the problem is so quickly, what it is. And we went into that last week, and you just can't get more source. I just have to mention this. This is not debatable. The people that don't want to go here can't debate it. They just use this term anti-Semitism. So we're going to, one of the things it addressed, one of it is whoever these people got in contact with for the last 3,000 or 4,000 years from every culture, every nation, the agenda is the same: subvert it and bend that culture, that race, that geographical location to our will. It's more acute in the Christian era because arguably the Zohar and Kabbalah work precisely as inversions of the incarnation of Christ. And in the Singularity, I argue that the Antichrist is re-engineering the incarnation. That said, so that's the issue. Also mentioned last week, anti-Semitism. Anybody in any place at any time that does not bend to the will of this agenda, that means for modern Christians say, we'll acquiesce more, we'll acquiesce more, all the way until the final chapter, Christ becomes hate speech. That's where we're at. Or this new document that wants to just say, there is no curse, there is no enmity, there is no collective guilt. Oh, for Christians, you're collectively guilty. You caused all the wars, you caused all the conflicts. The Germans are collectively guilty, but not for us. Okay, so it's a state of exception, permanent state of exception. Anybody that does not bend to that is anti-Semitic. And, there's such a waking up in the last year or year and a half. And part of that is people that are willing to tackle the question straight on. And a lot of it are these great Jewish podcasters that are saying, if they can't call you an anti-Semite, then they call you a self-hating Jew, but it's running really thin right now. So we're at a point right now, we truly have to understand reality, to reclaim reality and the fullness of reality, which is the mystical body of Christ through his incarnation, death, and resurrection left us this mystical body. In order to reclaim that and our own faith, or at least defend it, we have to understand the bluntness of this question, that its agenda is it is bent. Norman Finkelstein, like when he said it's Jewish supremacy, it's right. That defines the leaders of the group throughout history. They want everybody to bend to that, and the final goal is a J world order with Noahide laws and the enslavement of everybody that's a non-J. And that's it. It's over and over again. That's so if you just want to call somebody, if you're a Catholic podcaster and you just want to say, I'm anti, and I'm going to call you that name, and unfortunately it's the trads, and I'm virtue signaling. Okay, I'm being kind of blunt here, but that's cowardice in terms of the faith. And we have to kind of start saying that that's not virtue. The modernist political correctness lets you get away with that, but the traditional church teaching does not. Saint Maximilian would call you a coward.
Right.
And we have to have the spirit of militancy and martyrdom that he embraced if we're ready to defend the church at this time. So that's a little bit about the context of what we're going on. And I'm going to kind of pit how I think the article goes. Justin just got into a little bit here, but essentially, given that, how is the church using Christian means supposed to defend itself? Being charitable, not killing people. And we went through the list. The church and every other group has tried. There's 14 different things: expulsion, intermarriage, assimilation. Nothing's worked because of this component of Jewish supremacy. They're not going to assimilate. They're going to crush you. They're not going to assimilate. They'll let someone on the fringes go and say goodbye because that's kind of the secret society buffer zone that protects them. So go ahead, get assimilated. You're done with us. But that's the question. So here's this one of the people, Hilaire Belloc. I think I heard you say he was a little skeptical. There's going to be De Vries is one of the people involved in this conversation.
Mm-hmm.
But essentially, what could we expect? There's this character called De Vries who would say, well, Zionism, a home state, that would work if they stopped their usury, if at least 2/3 of the world diaspora went there, if they stopped their usury, if they stop meddling. Yeah, it's a perfect solution, but it's not a realistic, given the nature of how they've operated for the last 2,000 to 4,000 years. It's not very realistic at all. So what do we do with the Jewish question? Because what we're really seeing today, we're arguing, is not a product of Zionism, although it seems to. Herzl himself admitted we're building this thing up called Zionism to knock it down. It's just a peg in our long-term program. So Finkelstein is, I believe, correct. Jewish supremacism, but that brings us back to the question now that we have to face. It's not Zionism. Zionism should be a no-brainer. It's not Catholic. We don't yoke ourselves to it, but we have to take that question on. But we really need to detangle the two. What do you think in Catholic state?
Yeah. I mean, I think the Zionism thing, like you said, it's like it's in a sense, it's a little bit of a red herring. Not exactly, not like in the technical sense. It's like, because like you said, like we still have to tackle the question of Zionism, but the real big picture thing is Jewish supremacy. Like you said, like, like look at what's happening to our country. There's only one country in the world that has more Jews than the state of Israel, and that's the United States, right? And wherever they're at, they just have a history of de-Christianizing whatever country they live in if you give them power and influence, which is why the Fourth Lateran Council said not to do that under Pope Innocent III, and why all the popes up until the early modern church said not to do that, right? But anyways, so Zionism is one of those things where it's like it's always been against church teaching, but since it actually became a thing in the early 20th century, and like the state of Israel was actually made official in 1948, it was one of those things where I think Catholics, the modernist element within the church, were just like, aha, see, God can change his mind. The things can change. Catholic theology can change. And, even then the popes pushed back against it, like even all the way up through Pius the 12th, they pushed back against it. Even John, to give him credit, John the 23rd pushed back against it as a pope. Like he was pro-Zionist before he became a pope, but after he became a pope, he wouldn't, he wouldn't accept the state of Israel. Actually, Israel wasn't acknowledged as being a state until 1993 under John Paul II. So that's how long it took the church to actually accept Israel as a state. But it was kind of one of those things where I think it took the Catholic world by, like a lot of people didn't know how to handle it when it became a state in 1948, because it goes against Catholic theology. And then the modernists took advantage of this and said, hey, well, this is proof that God can change his mind, and that the Jews are still God's chosen people. And so we need to use this to change the teaching on the Jews, right? So Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where my position, and I think the traditional Catholic position in general, is that God has two kinds of wills. He has his active will and his permissive will, right?
Yeah.
And these neo-Judaizers and modernists just beg the question and act as if it was God's active will for Israel to become a state in 1948, right? A Jewish, and it exists as a Jewish state. Like that's the whole point of Zionism, is to make a Jewish state. And so they act as if this was God's active will. But if you look at the history of how Israel became a state, it's through blood, right? It's actually through the first two world wars. Like they purchased it with blood. I mean, World War I and World War II, a big reason that the United States got involved in both World War wars was because of the Zionist agenda, if you really look into it. So, I mean, they purchased the Holy Land with blood. So the question becomes, well, is it God's active will, or is it his passive will that he's essentially letting Satan have his day? And this is the traditional position, is that he is essentially, through his passive will, allowing the church to be chastised, allowing the world to be chastised, and allow Satan to have his day.
Yeah. It's God who created the enmity. This is immediately after the fall. You're going to fall. You're going to be in a new ontological reality. You're going to have to live by the sweat of your brow. And if you're earnest and open, your goal is to get back where you fell from. And and I will put enmity between these two seeds. That's the first prophecy of sacred scripture, but it's also the solution to the problem. So the very enmity, the very problem, is also the solution. And what we need to understand is this is God that ordained this enmity. He also put the mark on Cain, a mark of protection. In other words, they have, in God's cosmic plan, they have a role, we have a role. And part of that now is it trickled down to the typology of the church versus the synagogue from our perspective. And so we have to understand that they have a role, which is to crush the church. And we have a role of defending the church. So it's just what it is. And I think we have to be kind of blunt. When we blur that enmity, we are not helping the story of redemption history unfold in the way that the church would want it to baptize all nations in the name of the Father and the Son. And you're blurring the beatific vision. You're blurring the church's mission when you do that. Yes, it's great, very politically correct. You're being a great modernist when you do that, but you're not defending the church. And being kind of a traditionalist, where I like these, cafeteria traditional, I like all these parts, but the part that makes me feel uncomfortable, the part that won't sell with my base, that part, that's called the fullness of reality. Eric Voegelin had this idea called the second reality. I call it the egregore, where when we exclude a part of reality that's uncomfortable or inconvenient, then a new paradigm that now has a demonic ontology frames around us. So we're going to live in this partial reality, and we can't defend the church from that position. So says St. Maximilian Kolbe. So given that, let's just remind ourselves, it's the synagogue themselves. We call it the synagogue of Satan. That's what sacred scripture talks about it. And it operates typologically all the way from Cain to Esau to the Pharisees to the agenda right now to destroy and pervert Christian civilization, bring in Noahide and Antichrist. And they are the ones that say we are that force, that revolutionary force behind the Renaissance, behind the Protestant Revolution, behind the Enlightenment, behind what we call liberalism, classical liberalism, neoliberalism, all of it. That's their monopolistic control. Because I want to mention for a moment here the dialectic between communism and capitalism. It's very important because we have to stay in the middle in our minds and our faith where the church is located. They're responsible for the French and American revolutions, these Masonic republics that have been propped up throughout the world, Marxism. And from our perspective, their bankers are responsible for all of the wars since the French Revolution. All these isms designed, all of the wars designed to prepare the world for the coming of their Mashiach. And one of the agendas. They have to control the wealth of the world and the minds of the world in order to enslave the world. This is hard if you've never heard this before, but I'm not like speculating or anything like here. I'm
What they
just going
say.
back to the JQ as it was
Yeah.
understood in 1937. It was also understood right at the advent of Vatican II, but nobody was ready to do that. And again, the World War II narrative was substituted for the eternal sacrifice of Christ to varying extents. But the idea is that's the goal. To ultimately, that is the sacrifice. That is the substitution sacrifice. That's intended. The completion of that sacrifice is intended. The 6 million number. So a little bit more that I want. Here's one thing I want to mention that I found kind of interesting. There's really 2 points from this article, and then we're probably going to do it a little bit more and hop over to locals and really dig into it more. But one of the features of this article, again, how do we defend ourselves? Is Zionism the solution? I think we see from events in the world today, it is not the solution. It's really just an extension of the JQ agenda. But here's what they said appears in 1937, how they start the article. Here's the cycle. The cycle starts at number 1, ends at number 5, rinse and repeat. The Jays are welcome without prejudice. Number 2, tolerated, even though they gain a financial advantage, usually through networking and collusion within their diaspora. And again, for them, this is what they cite. The diasporas are strength. This is how we're able to pull it off, that we're not committed to any land, right? We're like pirates of the sea. Anyway, welcomed. Number 2, tolerated. Number 3, they come to dominate the finances through network and conclusion. Then there's number 4, opposition, irritation, usually held in check by the clergy and the government. It's usually the clergy that says, come on, be good Christians, just deal with it. And finally, number 5, hostility, and they are driven away, rinse and repeat, continuously, no counterfactuals, all culture. So we've been living in quite a period of time here, I think, held in place over a barrel because of the World War II narrative. What has happened, I argue, is that all this memory hole material that was out there and externalized in order to create the Zionist solution, the memory hole material was pushed down. The new World War II narrative was elevated and celebrated in Hollywood, in Netflix, over and school of public education, over and over again. Only people that were ever, state of exception. Nobody else had, this sort of experience in the world. And so you kind of got that. So I found that part of the cycle fascinating. And really the last thing I want to get in today is this dialectic that the article mentions. It's the same dialectic we talk about today. When we look at reality and we take the news at face value, we take the controlled alternative conservative news at face value. I argue we can't defend reality if we're just repeating the lies because we don't understand the agenda and how the synagogue operates. So I want to hit on that, but I want to go back to you, Catholic State.
Yeah. I mean, everything you're saying is correct. I mean, there's what we're living through when in regards to the Jewish question. It is very cyclical. It has been. I just made a post on Twitter here a little bit ago in response to the big "I hypocrite" poster. Like how he made the claim how in the early church, like in the 4th century, we had a lot of laws that were very nice to the Jews and lenient and let them have positions of influence. Well, what happens when that happens? Well, then they start de-Christianizing our society, and then then people start getting angry. The clergy and the government, like you said, is permissive at first, and then the clergy starts getting angry too with the people and starts pushing back, and then the government pushes back, and then all of a sudden, like there's hostilities, and then the Jews are usually expelled. that usually is how it happens historically. And we're living through this cycle right now where we see in the United States, the USCCB are cowards and traitors. They signed that ADL B'nai B'rith thing saying, oh yeah, you can't criticize the Jews because that's quote unquote anti-Semitic, which is just a nominalist word. It has no meaning anymore. It's like calling somebody racist or sexist. It doesn't even have any meaning anymore, right? So basically, we're going through that cycle right now where we're seeing the faithful are saying, look, this is what they're doing to our country. They're de-Christianizing us. They're hurting us. They're persecuting us. You bishops need to protect us. The country, the leaders of the country need to protect us, and they're not there yet. They're still on the side of the Jews, but it'll eventually happen to where they'll, if the cycle continues as it's been historically, where the hostilities will boil up to the point where the church goes, yeah, okay, well, we have to get rid of this. But it seems that the clergy and even the government itself sells out to the Jews first. It always happens.
Yeah. I mean, we didn't even mention world events as they're bombing, this is like kill Amalek stuff from the Old Testament, as they're cleansing not just the people, but the dogs, the greenhouses, anything with life has to be destroyed utterly. As they're doing that and high-fiving each other this week, one of the programs I mentioned, Useful Idiots, actually said, we're the only people that are going to mention this. One other person, a journalist on Mainstream, actually mentioned it and his job got displaced immediately after. We're not talking about this. We're talking about instead enabling them and shutting ourselves up. This week in England, new laws are being proposed where you can't pray or put hands on public and so forth. We're being crushed. This is happening. This is real. And nobody wants to address this reality. Right. And I use the word reality. We're in an ontological war of reality. And so one piece of this that we have argued, this is what I'm doing and what I'm creating, the Apocalypse of the Saints, St. Stephen, St. John Chrysostom, the St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, and I will go through the rest. They understand you have to understand the reality of the JQ in order to build Christian civilization and to follow the beatific vision. As we live in fear of the J's, we acquiesce to that power, and that's where we're at right now. So the people that are actually talking up and mentioning, this is what the saints said, this is what they did, you're considered crazy because they know it's true and they can't deal with you. That's where the church is at right now. So Jules Isaac that went in there, just to remind you, this is what the church acquiesced to in Vatican II. He said, all the problems in the world are from you. The war, everything's your problem. The gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they're complete liars. What happened in Passion Week is just a fiction. It's a joke. He said it's absurd. He said the doctors of the church are liars and anti-Semites. Our apostles are liars and anti-Semites, the people that built it. He said this is an abomination. You need to bend. You need to get rid of the curse. You need to get rid of the enmity. You're the bad guys. There's an enmity because you're trying to hurt us, not the other way around. And the church bent, not totally, but it bent way too much. Right. And I call it disordered because it's saying that we're all kumbaya. There's kind of a second covenant. There's truths everywhere. Those are kind of true. Absent the all authority on heaven and earth given to Jesus Christ. Absent that, it's disordered. It's unbalanced. It's perverted. And so people kind of speaking and still pointing fingers at what we're doing, saying, I don't even know if these guys are Catholic. That's where we're at with this conversation, because we've been socialized by this media, by this education system. We've been socially engineered to biopolitically, mimetically feel that way, but it's completely disordered from the way the church has always understood its mission in the world and identifying this problem in the world. So it's very problematic. So let me say one fascinating thing. I'd like to read a little bit of it, but today we talk about the dialectic, and it's still kind of new here. It's been around in Truther land for quite a while, but I think Catholic influences are still trying to wrap their head around lesser of two evils. You got to pick one. We got to get involved. No, it is kind of a setup. And what the article in 1937 calls it is the double They call it the case of the double play. It's a dialectic. And I want to go into that a little bit. And it's so important to understand how they sort of rig events, rig reality, stage politics, and so forth. We have to be able to see that so we don't yoke ourselves to these events, these lies, the spectacle, because a lot of this just becomes part of the spectacle. And even just accepting a lot of assumptions that Zionism and America are one. Well, it is. We built a Masonic republic that was eventually meant to embrace this heresy called Zionism, but it's not part of the church teaching. We embrace it through embracing our Americanism. Right. So we have to really cleanse ourselves from that mindset, get a new historical perspective on reality, so that when you see that, oh, the woke was created so you could come over here, create the anti-Semitic legislation, deport all of these people, and yeah, they're going to mix it up where there's some gangbangers here and there, but it's ultimately it's a Trojan horse to bring in digital surveillance. There's the bigger agenda. Look at these people. Look at who the Habads are and look at the influence. This is very significant. You can't just, well, he knows these, but he said something like Happy Easter this week, so everything's good. I'm going to look at this, but not look at that. You're not helping. You really have to understand the fullness of what's going on through the dialectic. This is how they operate. So it's fascinating. The ultimate dialectic, I say, goes back to the Zohar, which is this God or these forces that are both good and evil, and they obey one and disobey another. That's part of the religion that does this at a very metaphysical level. But on the ground, what they do here, I'm on page 3. It's not a very long article. I think it has 10 pages. De Vries is being referenced here to better understand the double play. We would call it the dialectic today. The Jays create capitalism. And we always one of the tricks with John Birch Society and these other kind of neoconservative, they conflate free markets with neoliberalism or capitalism. It was always they take credit. Yeah. We created controlled capitalism. We control the markets. It's one big casino and we're the house. And it's important to understand that. They were the people on the ground in Holland when this was created. It was imported to the Anglo-American empire. It's really the seedbed of our belief system. It has that in there, oftentimes just hiding itself behind this concept of free markets. And anyway, they create capitalism and they create the opposition to capitalism. And what it says here is the J people, creator and at the same time demolisher. And they're the builders and the destroyers. The Masons, of course, are the builders, but they're also the destroyers of the capitalist system. Is sometimes attributed by some to some design of the diabolical perfidy that is the Jays have first created capitalism, knowing well that it would throw the world into inexorable difficulties. Let me finish that. From which they would then profit and subjugate the whole world. And even if we're not Marxists, there's some observations from Lenin, in fact, knew that this system would exhaust itself, this cyclical system of capitalism. It has kind of created the illusion of having legs through war and a reconstruction economy. Mainstream economists recognize this right now. It had some fatal flaws from the get-go. It was a system, unlike the Catholic social order, it wasn't made to go forever because it is made as I know this sounds Marxist, but it is made as a colonial exploitative system that it exploits the hinterlands back to the base. These things I know, but we get in this left-right thing. Well, I'm capitalist because I'm not that. I'm not. This is the mind thing that we're getting, and they're explaining right here exactly how it works. Further, the Jays, creator of the capitalist system, has found the means to enrich themselves and impoverish the non-Jays. It's that simple. And that's where we get into the World Economic Forum. You will have nothing and be happy. That's the J utopia. That's the J world order that they're building. That's part of it. You're being prepared through this predictive programming and all that kind of stuff. I think if you've been around a bit, the Jays are the demolishers of the capitalistic system, does not tend to enrich themselves but to enrich the Jays collectively and to raise his people to the position of world dominator. That's the agenda. Noahide laws, the purification, everything that, for example, that are Christian have to be made kosher. They call it making the pig kosher. So you have to reject the tenets of Christianity, the divinity of Christ, the triune nature of God, the resurrection of the body, all the things that are the essence that make Christianity will be purified. And we see that happening with the impending hate legislation when Christ becomes hate speech. These are the things that have to go. So everybody that's still around saying I'm an anti-Semite and I just want to play it like this and that, those days are over. You have to realize and you can say, oh, I feel so much for their sensitivity about what happened 40 years ago, but you're blind to what's going on in the world and you're thinking it's going to be contained there. That's not the agenda. That's not the agenda. It's going to be rolled out to all humanity. Our politicians are bought and paid for. They do not have our backs. There are not many options here. Zionism is a failed option. I think that's what the authors of this article concluded, and we're seeing that in the world today. We have to come back to brass tacks and understand the JQ as they understood it in the first half of the 20th century from the greatest scholars, theologically, politically, academically, that investigated this question. And what are we going to do? And we have to return to that if we want to be honest ourselves. How are we going to defend the church? How are we going to defend our individual faith when on the immediate horizon, this isn't a long-term thing, there are plans to make us compromise publicly what it means. And we see indications of that going on in Europe and just this week in England. Catholic state, do you have some thoughts you want to maybe kind of round?
Oh, yeah. I got a few thoughts. So one of my thoughts is regarding our leaders. Trump actually sent something out through the White House here 9 days ago about Education and Sharing Day USA. If you don't know what that means, that started under Reagan, and it became law under Reagan, and it was ratified by Bush Sr. and Clinton, and now it's Trump. But what this is it's a nod to the Lubavitchers. It's a nod to Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson and the Lubavitchers. So when they promote Education Day, what they're really saying is that they're on the side of the Lubavitchers, they're on the side of the Noahide laws, and they are basically kissing their feet and saying, yes, we're on our side. So you look this up. It's whitehouse.gov, presidential actions 2025, Education and Sharing Day USA 2025. So yeah, and going along with that, what Dr. Haugen was saying before, he was talking about how the Judeo-Freemasonic how their system works. They follow the Baphomet system. And so if you don't know Baphomet, he's a demon, and on his arms, if you look at the statues, it says Salve et Coagula, which is Latin for dissolve and put back together. So what they do is, first step is to break down order, which is Catholic order, Christian order, God's order. And the second step is to create a new order, right? So they both, like Doug said, they both destroy and rebuild. But when they rebuild things, they rebuild it in a way that's disordered. What they do is they create this dialectic, and that's essentially what Doug is talking about here, this dialectic where they create one side and the other side. So they created both communism and capitalism, right, that seem to be opposed, but really they're not. Because if you look at the systems of communism and capitalism, all the power is centralized by the state. When you look at capitalism, all the power is centralized by the private elite. So either way, the power is centralized through these the elite state or the money elite, and it's always the Jays, right? It's both sides. It's the Jays and their Freemasonic allies, right? So they create this dialectic, but you don't see it because you try to play one side or the other and act as if they're opposing, but they're not, right? So that's how they do things. So it's important to understand that right now, like this, even like when we're talking about Zionism today, there's a dialectic here. It's Zionism, which is a form of Jewish nationalism, versus globalism versus universalism, acting like they're two separate things. No. The Jews want their own state where from that one state they control the rest of the world. So it's important to understand that these are not opposing things. These dialectics are just part of the part of the show. They're part of the spectacle, as Doug always says.
Yeah. And I think Dennis Krager recently boasted that we created all the isms except Catholicism.
Yep.
I think he did Nazism, but I'd take him on that. But that's
Yeah.
maybe for another show. But yes, they're all created and designed into the direction you just said, a world capital from Jerusalem, Noahide laws and world domination and subjugation of the world masses to
Right.
our order. And that's the agenda. And they're all created or usurped and spun to that direction. And so that's why we come back to the fullness of the Catholic faith as understood under the Catholic social order to get the fullness of reality, to see how we can get our heads around the fullness of reality and return to that. And a lot of pitfalls are things like libertarianism, thinking it's the government that controls it. Well, we see right now today with all the public-private partnerships with the tech bros, which are really just part of DARPA, that you can get tyrannized from any direction. It's only the church that was really, and people are saying, well, the church, Catholic Church is so evil and did X, Y, and Z. Yes, it's got a human element and a spiritual element, but it was always drawn in terms of when it created politics and society, the supernatural element was in control, that all things were organized to bring the bodies, minds, and souls of people up to follow the beatific vision into eternal salvation. And that, through the things like the creation of the Enlightenment, that this revolutionary force was about, they would relabel that the Dark Ages. And from a Catholic perspective, that was the highest point of unity in the church. And that's what Christ longed for, the unity of the church. So starting with the Renaissance and the Protestant Revolution, it's been chop, 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 chop. And so our desire, at least understanding that metaphysical unity that Christ desired for his people. And we're going to finish it at that. We're going to go over to locals and we're going to do a wind down segment over there. And again, the links to that community are going to be in the description section. And the bottom line with that community, if you enjoy conversations like that, it is to stimulate these ideas, to understand how to defend the church, to understand how the synagogue operates and weaponizes so many things that seem normal. But ultimately, if you want to go over there, it's $5 a month, but it's ultimately, please go over there if your real goal is to be involved in Christian fellowship and building up one another in our Christian faith, our Catholic faith. We have different perspectives over there. It's not the point to really argue out the resistance versus not. It's just in that particular space, our goal is to build one another up. And so that's what that's about over there. This has been Dr. Deep State. Thank you very much, Catholic State, for coming on with us today.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for having me on, Doug.
You bet. And everybody have a blessed Good Friday. I think this show will be on later today. And please enjoy your Easter celebration of the resurrection of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ.
Amen.